Evening twilight fell on the city, enveloping the streets in the soft light of lanterns. Chris stood at the window, holding a glass of wine, and thoughtlessly looked at the narrow paths lost in the darkness. He couldn't say he was worried, but a slight feeling of something strange had been drilling into his mind for several days. Jenny was delayed again. She explained this by work, long meetings with colleagues, and the need to take a walk after a busy day. It would seem nothing unusual, but now this happens almost every evening. Previously, their everyday life was scheduled almost hourly. Dinner, watching a movie, leisurely conversations about the past day. They had never been the kind of couple who built their lives according to a strict schedule, but a certain order of things existed, and it suited both of them. However, in recent weeks, the usual rhythm has begun to be disrupted. At first, there were rare delays, a call from work, an apologetic voice, a promise to be home soon. Then more and more often, now Jenny returns late almost every day. Chris ran his fingers along the rim of the glass. He was a reasonable man, accustomed to finding logical explanations for everything that surrounded him. He didn't like to give in to emotions, to make guesses without facts. And yet, something inside him persistently whispered, "Pay attention." He recalled their conversations. Jenny answered questions willingly, but as if without much detail. She talked about things at work, sometimes mentioning colleagues with whom she went to dinner. Another day, she talked about the desire to breathe in the evening air after a busy day. Chris had no reason not to believe her, but something still confused him. From time to time, he caught himself that her answers sounded even too precise. Today, he was home alone again. Muffled music was playing in the room, the clock was ticking rhythmically, and the air was filled with the faint aroma of Jenny's perfume, left over from her morning gathering. He looked at the phone. There was no message from her. Suddenly, he found himself listening to the sounds outside the window, as if hoping to hear the familiar noise of a motor or light footsteps along the path. Another half-hour passed. Chris finished his wine and put the glass on the table. Two voices fought in his head. One insisted that everything was fine, that he was making himself up for nothing. Another, quieter but persistent, whispered that his premonition did not lie. The quiet suburb seems frozen in time. Narrow streets, paved with smooth asphalt, stretched between rows of neat houses with small green lawns. Strangers were rarely seen here, and neighbors were known by name. Local residents were proud of their measured life, where every day was similar to the previous one. In the evenings, the streets were filled with the warm light of lanterns, and cozy lamps were lit in the houses. The air was permeated with the aroma of freshly cut grass and homemade baked goods, creating a feeling of security and stability. Chris and Jenny moved here about 10 years ago when he got a new position. At that time, they were not yet a married couple, but they already understood that they wanted to spend their lives together. They liked to imagine how they would raise their children in this place, walk through the shady parks, and meet their neighbors on weekends. In the early years, it seemed to them that they had found the ideal corner where they could live peacefully, without worrying about the bustle of the big city. Chris worked as an architect. He was 42 years old and had already built a successful career working with large construction companies. He loved his job, creating comfortable and beautiful homes, breathing life into space. His job allowed him to earn enough to provide a comfortable life for himself and Jenny, but lately he had felt that something was starting to fall apart. In the evenings, when he returned home, the house no longer seemed as cozy as it had been before. He noticed small changes that would have previously gone unnoticed: abandoned flowers on the windowsill, books not put away, empty cups on the kitchen table. These details seemed to add up to some kind of alarming premonition. Jenny was 7 years younger than him. She worked in the field of marketing, promoting large brands. She was always energetic and purposeful, but there was still some kind of lightness in her, which at one time attracted Chris so much. He often thought about how happy they were in the early years of their marriage. It seemed to them that nothing could shake their confidence in each other. They planned trips together, dreamed about the future, but gradually these conversations faded away. Jenny stayed late at work more and more often, returned home tired, and sometimes even irritated. But recently something has changed. Chris felt it. Perhaps it was all about Jenny's new habits, her evening walks, her prolonged delays at work. Perhaps he was just looking for a reason to worry himself. However, his intuition told him that everything was not so simple. He began to notice her absent-mindedness, subtle nervousness. Sometimes, when she thought that he did not see her, a strange expression appeared in her eyes, as if she was somewhere far away, not here. Neighbors still nodded welcomingly when they met. Children played in the park opposite their house, and fairs were held in the central square once a month. The cafe on the corner served the best coffee in the area, and the bakery across the street smelled of fresh bread every morning. But it seemed to Chris that something disturbing was hiding behind the facade of this idyll. The feeling of an impending threat that could not be explained grew within him every day. He found himself thinking that he was standing at the window for a long time, watching the street. He watched the lights flicker, the occasional car pass, and the passers-by slowly go about their business. Something was wrong here, but he couldn't figure out what yet. The night turned out to be dark and quiet. Chris sat in his office, staring at his laptop screen. The rain splashed lazily outside the window, leaving intricate patterns on the glass. He couldn't remember the last time he felt so lost. The time was approaching midnight, but I did not sleep. Scraps of thoughts, fragments of conversations with Jenny, her last, "I'll be late, don't wait for me," were spinning in his head. Inner restlessness haunted him, and he once again opened the browser to distract himself. But instead of news or the usual work sites, my gaze caught an article with a provocative headline, "9 Signs of Infidelity. How do you understand that your partner is cheating on you?" Chris almost closed the page, thinking it was tabloid nonsense, but something made him scroll down. A question that he did not dare ask himself out loud, as if he himself had found the answer on the screen. 1. Your partner has become more conscious of his appearance. Jenny always looked great. Her style was elegant, but without frills. However, over the past couple of months, she has updated her wardrobe and began to spend more time in front of the mirror. Chris noticed her new perfume more expensive than the ones she used before. She often wore a dress instead of her usual comfortable jeans and t-shirts. "It's just a change of image," he justified her changes, but now this fact has stuck in his head like a thorn. 2. Reducing the amount of intimacy. Previously, their intimate life was eventful. Even after years of marriage, they did not lose passion. But for several weeks now, Jenny has been withdrawing, using excuses like fatigue, headaches, and stress at work. Chris tried not to put pressure on her, but he felt the distance growing between them. If before they fell asleep huddled closely together, now she increasingly went to bed earlier and turned to the wall. 3. Constant delays at work. When Jenny began regularly coming home late, she always found an explanation. "We stayed late with our colleagues," she said, discussing a new project. At first he believed, but when this began to happen too often, doubts crept into his mind. What was especially strange was that she stopped complaining about work. Previously, she could spend hours talking about how annoying her bosses were and how difficult it was to work with clients. Now all conversations boiled down to a dry, "everything is fine." 4. Secret calls and correspondence. Previously, their phones were lying around everywhere on the kitchen table, on the sofa. But now Jenny did not let go of hers. She began to often go into another room to answer the call, and the phone screen was always locked. One day, Chris accidentally saw her quickly minimize the application when he entered the room. "Work matters," she said, but it seemed to him that her voice trembled. 5. Loss of interest in spending time together. They used to often go for walks on weekends, go to the movies, and have dinners in restaurants. Now Jenny agreed less and less to his proposals. "I'm tired. Let's do it some other time," she said, without even trying to offer an alternative. She seemed no longer interested in spending time with him. 6. Unexpected outbursts of irritability. Jenny has become more nervous lately. Sometimes she would snap at Chris over trifles, for an unwashed cup, for forgotten keys, for leaving the light on. He tried to chalk it up to stress, but her anger seemed too harsh, as if she was looking for a reason for conflict. 7. Excessive use of social networks. Jenny has always been on social media, but now it has become like an obsession. She constantly liked something, responded to messages, and posted photos. At the same time, her phone was always turned face down, and she brushed off Chris's questions about who she was communicating with. 8. Unexpected trips and changes of plans. Previously, they always planned their vacation in advance. But now Jenny increasingly mentioned business trips and meetings with friends that Chris had never heard of before. One day she said that she would go to her sister for the weekend, but then Chris found out that her sister had been in another city all this time. 9. Gut feeling. But what frightened Chris most of all was not Jenny's behavior, but his own premonition. It was with him constantly. He couldn't explain it, but he felt that something had changed. An invisible wall appeared between them. Chris read the article twice. A heaviness grew in my chest. Each word seemed to be seared into his mind, piecing together a puzzle that he had so studiously ignored. 9 signs, and almost all of them coincided. He slammed his laptop shut and ran his hand over his face. My heart was pounding. It can't be, he thought. I'm just stressing myself out. But something inside him told him that this was not just a coincidence. Chris sat in the kitchen, staring into a cup of already cold coffee. Emotions were seething inside him: anxiety, doubt, fear. He didn't want to believe what was written in the article, but there were too many coincidences. Every word, every line was reflected in Jenny's behavior. He had to find out the truth. When she returned home, it was already late. Dressed in a light coat and with her hair down, she looked as if she had just returned from a party. A slight blush on her cheeks, a sparkle in her eyes, and at the same time, tension was visible in her gaze, as if she was ready for a conversation, but did not want to start it. "You're late," Chris tried to make his voice sound even, without accusations. Jenny sighed without looking at him, took off her coat, and carefully hung it on the hook. "Yes, I'm late," she answered, heading towards the refrigerator. "We had dinner with clients." "Again? You said there would be no more meetings this week." She paused for a second before reaching for a bottle of water. "Well, everything changed at the last moment. One of the clients decided to sign the contract, and we celebrated a bit." "Is this bad?" She spoke evenly, but Chris detected the same evasiveness in her voice as before. For a long time, he was sure that there were no secrets between them. Now it seemed to him that a completely different person was standing in front of him. "Jenny," he looked straight into her eyes, "I would like to talk to you." "Of course," she answered, but her voice sounded strained. Chris took a deep breath. "You've changed lately. I don't want to make a scene, but you come late. You've developed some new habits. You don't tell me about your plans, and—" He hesitated, trying to find the words. "You have become different." Jenny raised her eyebrows, then leaned back in her chair and crossed her arms. "What do you mean?" she asked with slight wariness. Chris felt everything inside him shrink. He wanted to ask directly, but he was afraid of the answer. "I don't know," he admitted, "but it seems to me that something has changed between us. We began to communicate less, spend less time together. You avoided talking about work before, but now you barely talk about where you go or who you meet." Jenny bit her lip. She slowly took a sip of water, as if contemplating her answer. "Chris, are you following me?" There was a hint of irritation in her voice. "No," he straightened up sharply. "I'm just noticing. Isn't this true?" She looked away for a second. Then she got up and went to the window. Deep breath, exhale. "I really have a lot of work to do, Chris. A new project requires effort. I'm getting tired. I don't want you to worry. But I'm worried because you don't give me a reason not to worry." His voice became louder than he expected. Jenny turned sharply to him. "So what's up? Do you think I'm cheating on you?" Her words were like a blow from a whip. Chris froze. He didn't expect her to say it herself. He looked at her, trying to figure out if it was protection or something more. "I don't know what to think, Jenny." He ran his hand over his face. "But you're not helping me figure it out." She sighed, closed her eyes for a second, then slowly walked towards him. Chris, it hurts me to hear this from you. I love you, I really do. It's a difficult time right now. Maybe I really was too distant, but that doesn't mean I'm lying to you." Chris looked into her eyes. They were sincere, but in the depths they still hid something that he could not unravel. "Then tell me the truth," he asked quietly. "Are you happy?" Jenny froze. For a second, a shadow of doubt flashed in her eyes. Then she smiled, too forced, too perfect. "Of course, Chris. Do I give you any reason to think otherwise?" And it was that smile that made Chris feel like he was missing out on something very important. Chris sat in the living room, watching Jenny move around the room. She looked as usual, smiling, collected, but something in her behavior caused tension in him. Over the past few weeks, he had noticed a strange detail that had been nagging him. Her phone was always face down. It would seem like a small thing, but this particular little thing was one of those mentioned in that article. He remembered how Jenny used to completely calmly leave her phone anywhere on the table, on the nightstand, in the hallway. But now she did not let it out of her hands, and if she put it down, it was only with the screen down. Whether it was breakfast, an evening movie, or even their conversations, the phone was always hidden from his eyes. Chris noticed that she checked on him less often, but every time a notification came through, she seemed to tense up. One evening, when they were having dinner, he decided to test his guesses. Jenny put the phone next to the plate, and, as he expected, the screen was facing down. He felt anxiety growing inside him. He carefully reached for a napkin, made a careless movement to accidentally brush against the table, and the phone tilted slightly, almost turning over. For a moment, he saw the screen flash, but Jenny immediately grabbed the phone and quickly put it back, giving him a quick glance. "Everything is fine?" Chris asked, pretending not to notice anything. "Yes," she answered, smiling a little tightly. The moment was too short, but enough to fuel his doubts. What was she hiding? Previously, she could easily leave the phone in another room and even forget about it, but now it was always with her. Maybe it's just a habit, or something more. Over the next few days, he watched her even more closely. Every time the phone vibrated, she either quickly picked it up or went into another room. Sometimes she would look at the screen and immediately put it down without answering. It was strange. In the past, she always commented on messages, sometimes even joking about who was texting her. Now her silence spoke louder than words. The next day, when Jenny took a shower, Chris felt two feelings fighting inside him: trust and suspicion. He knew her password because once upon a time they did not hide anything from each other. However, the thought of taking her phone and checking it seemed treacherous to him. He was sure that Jenny would not approve of such an invasion of personal space either. But then why did it bother him so much right now? He walked over to the nightstand where her phone lay. His heart pounded in his chest as he slowly extended his hand. But before he could touch the device, he heard the sound of the water turning off in the bathroom. He quickly pulled his hand away and pretended to just look out the window. A few seconds later, Jenny came into the room, drying her hair with a towel. She looked at him, then at the phone, and without saying a word, she took it from the table. "Everything is fine?" she asked casually. "Yep, just wondering," Chris answered, forcing himself to smile. He saw her put the phone down next to her again, screen down. This gesture now seemed almost defiant to him. He couldn't decide whether he was overthinking himself or whether his fears were truly justified. More and more details in her behavior formed an alarming picture. Later, when he was lying in bed, Jenny had already fallen asleep, and he continued to think. He remembered an article saying that holding a phone upside down was a way to hide notifications, so your partner couldn't see who was texting. Maybe she just wants privacy, he thought. Or does she have something she doesn't want me to see? He turned on his side and looked at her. She was sleeping peacefully, her breathing was even. But even in this picture of peace, he felt a slight anxiety that did not leave him in recent days. He remembered how several times during the evening Jenny would go into another room for no apparent reason, as if she was just checking something on her phone. The next morning, he noticed another strange thing. When Jenny put the phone on charge, it was turned off. She hadn't done this before. This only meant one thing: she didn't want notifications to appear on the screen when he was around. The phone is face down. It would seem such a simple detail, but it was she who began to destroy his confidence that everything was fine in their marriage. Chris noticed this almost by accident. In the morning, when he went into the bathroom to brush his teeth, a subtle but unusually rich aroma hung in the air. These were perfumes, expensive, deep, seductive. They reminded him of something far away, maybe the commercials he saw on TV or the women who passed him on the street, leaving behind that elusive trace. But the main thing was something else. This smell was new. Jenny had never worn such perfume. She had her own preferences: light, floral scents that she used for years. Chris knew their scent very well, because every time she leaned towards him or passed by, her scent enveloped him, becoming part of their common life. But this one was different. More intense, more sensual. It didn't fit her usual style. At first, Chris didn't think much of it. Perhaps Jenny just decided to try something new. After all, every woman has times when she wants change. But when he began to notice this smell every day, he realized that this was not an accident. Every morning, when she said goodbye to him, Jenny left this scent in the air, and each time it seemed to remind him that something had changed. He began to notice that this smell was not just a random touch of her image. It was part of something new that had appeared in her life. Who gave her this perfume? Or did she buy them herself? If you bought it, why didn't you tell me? After all, she always shared such little things with him before. One day, when Jenny had just gotten out of the shower, Chris unobtrusively asked, "Have you started using new perfume?" She froze for a second, but quickly regained her composure and shrugged. "Yes, I just decided to change the scent. Do you like it?" Chris thought about it. Her tone was too light, as if she had been preparing for such a question in advance. "They are very unusual," he said, trying to sound as neutral as possible. "Where did you buy them?" Jenny looked at him, narrowing her eyes slightly, then shrugged again. "In the store, of course. I just saw them and decided to try them." But Chris knew her too well. She is not one of those who just buys expensive perfumes at random. She usually studied reviews and tested fragrances several times before purchasing something new. Is this a sudden decision? It wasn't like her. A few more days passed, but the questions in his head only multiplied. He began to notice that Jenny did not always wear these perfumes, but only at certain moments. Most often before leaving somewhere. This was alarming. He decided not to ask new questions, but simply to observe. One evening, when she returned home later than usual, he caught the smell in the air, more intense than usual, as if freshly applied. It seemed as if she had deliberately freshened it up before entering the house. "Have you had a long day?" he asked, watching her take off her coat. "Yes," she answered with a smile. "A lot of work, negotiations. Everything is as always." But that was not the case. Something has changed. Chris felt it, but could not yet understand what exactly. He only knew that perfume was not just a new scent. This is a symbol of the changes that were happening to her, and he did not know what they would lead to. Chris met Craig shortly after he and Jenny moved to the area. Then everything seemed ideal: a new house, a quiet street, friendly neighbors. Craig especially stood out: a tall, fit man of about 45, with short, cropped brown hair and a wide, almost perpetual smile. He was one of those people with whom you can easily find a common language, even if you are not a particularly sociable person. Craig lived directly across the street, in a neat house with a spacious veranda and a well-kept lawn. His wife, Linda, was a sweet woman, but Chris rarely saw her at home. She often went to another city to care for her sick sister. Craig didn't seem unhappy about his wife's frequent departures. On the contrary, he always found a reason to joke that women need space, or that separate lives make marriage stronger. Their friendship with Chris began with a simple gesture. Craig came up one day while Chris was fixing something in the garage and offered to help. He turned out to be a man who is not afraid of working with his hands. He always knew how to fix a faucet, what to do with a garden pump, and even understood electricity. Their conversations were always light, peppered with jokes and stories about life. It turned out that they even had similar hobbies, both loved baseball and both tried fishing at one time, but were not particularly successful at it. On weekends, they sometimes drank coffee on Chris's veranda, discussing neighborhood news, sports, and life. Craig was talkative, but his stories never seemed empty. He always knew what to say and knew how to listen. There was something inviting in his manner of speaking. There was no intrusiveness that could irritate. He seemed like the perfect neighbor, friendly, open, ready to help at any moment. What Chris liked about him was that he never seemed overly curious. Unlike other neighbors who might ask about work, salary, plans for the future, Craig did not ask awkward questions. Discussing simple things was enough for him: the weather, repairs, news from the local newspaper. This made communication with him especially easy, without pressure and obligations. In addition, Craig was a man who always knew where to get everything. If you needed to find a good electrician, he knew the number. If the area ran out of grill gas, he would be the first to tell you where to buy it cheaper. Sometimes Chris was even surprised at how informed his neighbor was. It seemed like Craig knew everything that was going on in their area. During the first years of dating, their meetings were natural, without intrusiveness. If one of them had time, they could meet at the fence, exchange a few phrases, exchange opinions about a new store or another property tax. And if someone was busy, no one was offended. Everything was simple, easy, and relaxed. But in recent weeks, Chris began to notice something strange. Before, Craig visited him no more than a couple of times a week. Now he began to drop by almost every day. Under various pretexts, either "I came in to check how things were going," or "I accidentally saw an open garage door and decided to look in," or simply passed by and thought, "Why not have a coffee?" At first, Chris didn't think much of it. After all, this is Craig, his friend, neighbor, a person with whom it was always pleasant to talk. But the more often he appeared, the more Chris felt that there was something strange about it. What was especially alarming was that Craig never came when Jenny was home. It was as if he was choosing the moments when she wasn't around. And although Craig continued to be the same friendly neighbor that Chris knew and respected, deep down he began to feel a little uneasy. He tried not to attach much importance to it, but the feeling that something had changed did not leave him. Chris sat in the kitchen with a cup of strong coffee, but his thoughts were far away. Now that he began to pay more attention to little things, his memory helpfully brought up points that he had not paid attention to before. Everything that previously seemed like ordinary friendly gestures now took on a new shade. He remembered how Craig and Jenny laughed together, how they exchanged glances during the conversation. It didn't cause him any concern, then why not? His wife was an open person, loved to laugh, and loved to communicate with people. Craig, on the other hand, was always the person who could relate to anyone, make light conversation, and make people smile. Isn't this normal? But now other details popped into his head. How Craig sometimes joked and Jenny laughed a little longer than seems necessary. How one day Chris noticed that his neighbor, saying goodbye, put his hand on Jenny's back a little longer than usual. He didn't pay attention then, but now it seemed strange to him. Or here's another case. The three of them were sitting on the veranda, drinking wine, talking about something insignificant, and Jenny said, "Craig, you are simply unbearable. You always know how to make me laugh." Then Chris grinned and did not attach any significance to these words. But now, reviewing this moment in his head, he noticed how Craig smiled back, tilting his head slightly to the side, as if that comment meant anything more to him than just a compliment. He remembered another incident. A few months ago, he walked into the house after mowing the lawn and saw Craig and Jenny standing at the kitchen table. They spoke quietly, but at the same time they looked completely at ease. When Chris entered, they immediately fell silent and looked at each other. Then he decided that it was just a coincidence. Maybe they were discussing something without wanting to bother him. But now that his mind was filled with doubt, it seemed like a warning sign. He was especially embarrassed by Jenny's reaction. She never looked guilty when he walked into the room during her conversations with Craig. She continued to behave naturally. But what if it's because she has nothing to hide? Or, on the contrary, did she get so used to it that she learned not to give herself away. All this began to resemble a chain in which one suspicion clung to another. Remembering the article about the signs of infidelity, he noted for himself more and more coincidences. Jenny's detachment, her new perfume, the phone face down. And now there's Craig. Chris tried to calm himself down. He knew that he could screw himself up, that jealousy could make him see something that wasn't there. But with each new memory, the anxiety only grew. Maybe these are just coincidences, or was his intuition finally starting to tell him something he didn't want to see before? Chris never considered himself a jealous person. He always believed in trust, honesty, and respect for personal space. But now, when his mind was filled with doubts, all this seemed to him to be distant ideals. He convinced himself that he just wanted to know the truth. Not to blame, but to get rid of the anxiety that haunted him. After all, if everything turned out to be unfounded, he could finally relax. But for now, doubts grew inside him like weeds in a neglected garden. The idea of spying on his wife seemed absurd to him at first. After all, if he was confident in her, then why would he do this? But then the memory of the article about the signs of infidelity returned to his mind, like poison seeping into his mind. He remembered the phone, which she always put face down, her new perfume, her strange detachment, frequent delays. And of course, Craig. It all added up, and Chris felt that either he would find a way to confirm his suspicions, or he would go crazy. The decision came unexpectedly. He remembered reading somewhere about geolocation tracking apps. They were touted as useful tools for concerned parents who want to know where their children are. But now Chris didn't care how they were intended to be used. He wanted to know where Jenny went when she wasn't at home. He knew he was doing something unethical, but he couldn't stop. The opportunity came in the evening when Jenny went to take a shower. Chris knew he had no more than 10 minutes. He waited for the water to rustle in the bathroom, went to her bedside table, and took the phone. His heart was beating so hard that he was afraid he could hear it. It seemed to him that even the walls condemned his action. Unlocking his phone, he quickly went to the App Store and searched for GPS tracker. There were many options, but he needed one that worked quietly. He selected one of the apps, downloaded it, and configured it to send him data to his phone. He read reviews, choosing the most reliable one, looked through the instructions, and checked whether it would really remain invisible. His fingers trembled as he filled out the settings. At some point, it seemed to him that the sound of the water had stopped, and he looked around sharply, holding his breath. But then he realized that it was just his nerves. After finishing the installation, he hid the application icon in a folder with little used utilities. If Jenny doesn't specifically look for it, she's unlikely to notice it. He then checked several times to see if the application was working correctly. Every new notification, every screen change sent him into a panic attack. Putting the phone back, he walked away, sat on the sofa, and picked up his mug of tea, pretending that everything was fine. But everything inside him was turning upside down. He had just crossed a border he had never even thought about before. He broke the trust on which their relationship was built. But his mind told him that if his worries turned out to be justified, then he was doing everything right. It's just for peace of mind, he tried to justify himself. I don't want to be the one who lives in ignorance. If there is nothing, then I'm just worrying in vain. If there is, it's better to know the truth. He tried to brush off the guilt, but it clung to him, piercing his consciousness, reminding him of what he had done. When Jenny came out of the bathroom, he looked at her with a new acuteness of perception. She smiled, unaware that her phone was now transmitting his location, and Chris could only wait. He realized that now he would not be able to relax until he checked the data. With every minute, the desire to pick up the phone and see where she was became stronger. He felt both terrible and strangely excited, as if he had moved into some new reality, where the rules of morality could be adjusted to suit his fears. When Chris finally opened the app and looked at the data he received, he felt something clench inside him. He expected anything, but not this. Jenny didn't stay late at work as often as she said she would. She didn't visit her friends as often as she claimed. Instead, Her phone regularly showed the same point, a small park on the outskirts of the city. The first time Chris decided not to attach any importance to it. Maybe she just went there to get some air after a busy day. The park really was quiet, well kept, with neatly trimmed bushes and a couple of benches under the treetops. But the more he tested, the harder it was to ignore the pattern. She appeared there at the same hours between 5 and 7 in the evening. This time coincided quite well with those moments when she said that she had unexpected delays. Chris began to study the history of her movements. She has visited this park 7 times in the past 2 weeks. Always on weekdays, always around the same time. On weekends, she stayed home as if nothing was happening. But now he could no longer help but see the obvious. There was some reason for this. My heart was pounding in my chest. An inner voice insisted that he was making it all up, that perhaps there was a logical explanation. But the mind, infected with fears and guesses, insisted on the opposite. What if she's meeting someone there? If she lies to someone, it means she has a good reason for it. He began to scroll through the options. Perhaps she really just wants to be alone and think. But why didn't she tell him about it then? Maybe she just needs a break from him and doesn't know how to say it directly. Or was someone waiting for her in this park? Chris couldn't sit still. He began to mentally imagine this park, its alleys, empty benches, possible routes. He remembered that once upon a time he and Jenny walked there when they first started dating. The place was nice, cozy, but not so cozy that Jenny suddenly started spending so much time there alone. The decision came naturally. He had to see it with his own eyes. Staying in the dark was the worst thing. He told himself that he would just make sure he was worrying for nothing. Maybe he would see her sitting on a bench with a book or chatting with someone on the phone. That perhaps this fear is just a figment of his imagination, fueled by an article about treason. But part of him already knew that he wouldn't stop. He had to find out the truth. Chris arrived at the park earlier than Jenny. He deliberately chose a place away from the central paths, where he could hide behind the trees but still have a good view. Everything was tight in my chest, my palms were sweaty, my heart was pounding in my ears. He had never felt like this before, as if he was violating someone else's boundaries, as if he was going beyond what was permitted. But these were his boundaries, his marriage, his life. He settled down behind the trunk of a large oak tree, partially hidden behind the bushes. From here, there was an excellent view of the main alley, along which people were leisurely strolling, enjoying the warm evening. He didn't know how long he would have to wait, but he was ready to endure as long as he could until he saw her. 10 minutes passed. Then another 15. Every time a woman passed by, Chris froze, looking closely to see if it was Jenny. Finally, after half an hour of waiting, he saw her. She walked slowly, looking around, as if checking if she was being followed. She looked the same as always, flawless. Her dark hair was neatly pulled back into a ponytail. Her light dress fluttered softly in the wind. There was no anxiety or excitement on her face, only concentration and a slight smile. She turned down a side path and stopped at a bench. Chris clenched his fists, trying to control the trembling in his hands. It seemed to him that time had slowed down, that something was about to happen that would destroy his world. And then Craig showed up. He came from another alley, wearing ordinary casual clothes, jeans, and a t-shirt. He walked confidently, but slowly, and stood directly in front of Jenny. They did not hug, did not touch each other, but their bodies were so close that there was no air between them. Chris clenched his jaw. He couldn't hear what they were saying. They were talking quietly, too quietly. Jenny tilted her head, smiling slightly. Craig leaned closer, speaking into her ear, and she nodded slightly. They did not touch each other, did not show any obvious tenderness. But their closeness was obvious. This was the level of trust and comfort that exists between people who have a common secret. Chris felt something dark and heavy growing inside him. He clenched his fists so tightly that his nails dug into his palms. He tried to breathe deeper, but the air did not fill his lungs. He couldn't believe this was happening before his eyes. Jenny said something, and Craig laughed quietly. She leaned forward as if about to say something else, and he listened intently. Their poses, glances, slight tilts of their heads, everything said that there was something more between them than just friendship. But at the same time, if Chris showed this scene to someone, one could say that there is nothing suspicious here. They were just talking. But he saw the truth. He felt it with every cell of his body, and this truth caused him unbearable pain. Chris couldn't take his eyes off the scene unfolding in front of him. He tried to breathe evenly and control his emotions, but it was becoming more and more difficult. Jenny and Craig were still standing too close. Their conversation continued, and there was something alarming in their every movement. He tried to convince himself that all this was just a figment of his imagination, but then something happened that deprived him of his last hopes. Craig, as if unnoticed by those around him, took a small envelope from his pocket. It was a subtle gesture, so smooth and confident that if Chris hadn't been watching their every move, he would have missed it. The envelope was small, beige, with no visible writing. Craig leaned forward slightly, pretending to adjust the sleeve of his shirt, and handed it to Jenny. She wasn't even surprised. Without further words, without a hint of hesitation, her fingers gently accepted the envelope, and she immediately hid it in her bag without even looking at it. This gesture was practiced and natural, as if this is not the first time. Chris felt his heart clench with a new wave of jealousy and anxiety. What's in this envelope? Why does Jenny accept him so easily, so calmly? If it was something minor, she would at least open it and check the contents. But no, she hid it as if she knew in advance what was inside. His thoughts were racing wildly. Maybe it's just a note. Perhaps Craig gave her some important information related to their work. Or is it something more personal? Maybe a love letter? Or even something even more frightening? Chris clenched his fists, looking at his wife's expression. But her face gave nothing away. She continued to smile and talk to Craig as if nothing had happened. How could she act so calmly? He waited for at least a hint of excitement, a hint of nervousness, but he noticed nothing. Jenny remained as casual as ever. A feeling flared up in his chest that he had never encountered before. It wasn't just jealousy. It was a feeling of loss of control, a feeling that his world was falling apart, and there was nothing he could do. He watched his wife, her hands, which were now gripping the strap of her bag tighter. She was clearly in a hurry to leave, and Craig also looked as if the conversation had come to an end. Chris barely restrained himself from coming out of hiding. He wanted to come up and demand an explanation. He wanted to know the truth right now. But his intuition told him that if he did this, he would destroy everything. No, he needs to wait for the right moment. Find a way to find out what was in that envelope without revealing yourself. When Jenny and Craig went their separate ways, Chris realized that a new game had now begun for him, a game of searching for answers. Chris returned home later than usual. The day at work turned out to be long, filled with endless meetings, numbers, calculations, but this did not distract him from the thoughts that were increasingly absorbing his mind. He felt the tension growing within him, like steam accumulating in a closed saucepan. He didn't know what exactly to expect today, but he knew he needed to stay calm. Jenny was already at home. She stood at the stove, preparing dinner, and seemed no different from the wife he had known for years. The usual picture: she is in home clothes, her hair is gathered in a careless bun, the aroma of spices is in the air. Everything looked so familiar, but Chris knew that inside him there had not been the same peace for a long time. "Hello, dear. How was your day?" she asked, turning around and smiling. Chris tried to look normal and forced himself to smile back. It's usual. Work, work, work. You know how it goes. How are you? Oh, not bad either, Jenny shrugged, returning to the stove. Lots of things to do, clients. The phone was ringing off the hook all day. Kate was late for a meeting with a client again. I was furious. She spoke, as usual, with a slight intonation of irritation, but Chris hardly listened to her. He looked at her bag lying on the kitchen chair. It was at this moment that he had an idea. Perhaps this was the only chance. "You're so late today. Did something delay you?" Jenny asked, giving him a quick glance. "It's just a lot of work," he answered, trying to sound casual. "I'm already dreaming of going to bed." I understand, she nodded. Let's have dinner, and you can rest a little. Certainly. I'll wash my hands now, he said and headed towards the bathroom, but, passing by the chair where her bag lay, he silently lowered his hand inside. His fingers felt something soft and folded. Note. He quickly took it out, clenched it in his fist, and walked on, pretending to go to the bathroom. The door closed behind him, and only then did he allow himself to open his hand. On a small piece of paper, written in an even, neat handwriting, there was only one phrase. I'll be waiting for you tomorrow at 12. You know where. Chris felt his heart beat faster. Everything inside him shrank into a painful lump. This was confirmation of the worst. The confirmation he was so afraid of. He looked at himself in the mirror. The face is pale, tense, lips are compressed. Blood was pounding in my temples. He tried to breathe deeper, but his lungs seemed to have collapsed. A minute later, he put the note in his pocket and went into the kitchen. Jenny was already setting the table. He sat down, trying to control himself. The smell is amazing, he said, putting food on his plate. Have you prepared anything new? Yes, I decided to try a new recipe. It's chicken in honey mustard sauce, she smiled. Chris chewed slowly, although he didn't feel like eating at all. He watched Jenny eat and how calmly she behaved. Maybe he's wrong. Maybe this is all just a coincidence. Is tomorrow a long day too? He asked, trying to speak casually. Yes, I think so. A lot of work, and she also promised to visit her mother in the evening, she answered without a shadow of a doubt. She was lying. He knew it, but he didn't show it. He nodded and took another sip of water. Do you want to watch something after dinner? Jenny asked. Come on, he nodded. Something light. Comedy. She smiled. Excellent choice. Need to relax a little. Chris nodded, but everything was boiling inside him. Tomorrow, 8 o'clock. He must know the truth. Chris sat in the darkness of his bedroom, looking at the crumpled note he had taken from his pocket. I'll be waiting for you tomorrow at 12. You know where? These words burned through his mind like a flaming torch in the night. He felt a hurricane of emotions raging inside him: anger, pain, fear, despair. He wanted to burst into the living room, demanding an explanation right now, but something held him back. He took a deep breath. If he makes a scandal now, what will it give him? Jenny, of course, will be able to get out of it, saying that this is just an innocent meeting, that nothing special is happening. Maybe she'll lie to his face, maybe she'll turn it into a joke. But he could no longer trust words. He needed proof. Chris knew that anger could cloud one's judgment. If he fails, he risks remaining in the dark. He knew that if he wanted to get to the truth, he needed patience. You need to see everything with your own eyes, hear their conversation, make sure that he is not mistaken. Only then will he be able to dot all the I's. He looked at the note again. Tomorrow at 12. Where? He didn't know, but he guessed. Most likely the same park. It was where Jenny went at the same hours, and it was where he saw her with Craig. This means that if he gets there earlier, he will find out the truth. Chris unclenched his fingers, and the note fell onto the bedside table. He got out of bed, went to the window, and looked out onto the street. The city lived its own life. Cars could be heard somewhere in the distance. Someone was laughing as they passed by the house. But inside him, everything was different. There was emptiness inside him. The decision was made. Tomorrow, he won't say a word to Jenny. He won't show that he knows anything. He will just go to the park, hide and watch. He will catch them red-handed. And then he will no longer need words. Just the facts. He went to bed, but there was no sleep. In the darkness, he could hear Jenny moving in the other room, the bathroom door closing, the rustle of fabric as she got into bed next to him. She turned to him. Her breathing was even calm. It was as if nothing had happened. And tomorrow everything will change. Chris sat in his car in a parking lot near his house, his eyes glued to his phone screen. The numbers on the display showed 11:55. Soon the moment he had been waiting for would come, the one that would confirm or destroy his guesses. The tracking program was running. The signal was updated every few minutes, and he knew that Jenny was still at home. He was in no hurry to go to work. Today, he took a day off, although his boss was unhappy. But Chris didn't care. Today, he had more important business to attend to. At 12:03, the signal changed. The small red marker on the map began to move, indicating that Jenny had left the house. Chris held his breath. He waited to see where she would go. Second by second, his heart beat faster. And then the point stopped. Craig's house. My chest felt tight and my ears began to buzz. He knew that the neighbor's wife had left a few days ago. Jenny said she had a meeting at work today, but instead she was here. Chris wasted no time. He started the car and carefully moved forward, trying to keep a safe distance so that no one would notice his observation. Pulling up to the next block, he turned off the engine, got out, and silently moved toward Craig's house. The curtains in one of the windows are slightly open. Chris stepped closer, feeling his palms become covered in sweat. He slowly peeked around the corner, trying not to breathe too loudly. It was quiet inside. He noticed shadows moving around the room, but it was difficult to make out details. He knew that if he made one wrong move, if he attracted attention, things might not go according to plan. Chris moved a little closer. At this moment, laughter was heard. Light, muted, feminine. My heart sank. He recognized that voice. Chris stood in the thick shadows behind the fence, clenching his teeth so tightly that his cheekbones began to cramp. It seems that the whole world around has fallen silent, leaving him alone with his own heart, beating in time with every movement outside the slightly open window. He felt his body freezing, and at the same time everything inside was burning with such a fire of rage that it seemed like he was about to explode. Before his eyes, through a gap in the curtains, unfolded something he had never expected to see, or rather, what he feared most. In the soft darkness of Craig's living room stood Jenny, his wife, the same woman whom he considered closest, whom he believed and trusted. Now she stood here, in front of a strange man, a neighbor, and looked as if her entire being was consumed by desire. At first he could not make out the details, but every moment the terrible truth became clear to him. Her hair, usually neatly styled, fell over her bare shoulders. She was standing too close to Craig, and when he put his hand under her blouse, it became clear to Chris. This was not an innocent flirtation, not an accidental touch. It was obvious, greedy intimacy, the kind that destroys families. Chris's heart began to beat with renewed vigor when Jenny allowed Craig to pull off her outerwear. He felt the heat rising in his throat, the desire to rush inside mixed with absolute helplessness. Dirty traitor throbbed in his temples. What a damn snake! He even caught himself thinking that curses were bursting out without his will in shocks in the brain, but they could not be stopped. With every moment, these insults in his head became more and more violent, louder. Jenny, meanwhile, clearly forgot about everything in the world. Craig ran his hands lightly over her waist, sliding down, and she let out a quiet moan that made Chris's blood run cold. He didn't just hear, he saw how her lips parted in trembling excitement, how she clings to Craig's shirt, as if afraid that he might pull away. But he did not pull away, on the contrary, their embrace became closer and closer, and now it was no longer possible to doubt what they were doing. For a brief moment, Chris tried to fool himself by closing his eyes, as if that could erase reality. But as soon as he looked out the window again, the illusion was destroyed. Craig, holding Jenny close to him, penetrated into her in such a way that there was no doubt left they had long crossed the line beyond which there was no turning back. Their bodies moved in unison. "Damn bitch," he hissed under his breath, feeling an angry, inexpressible despair squeezing his throat. He didn't want to believe what he was seeing. Before him was not just a scene of intimacy, it was a real merger, in which his wife found what, apparently, she was missing next to him. Chris's hand shook as he clutched the phone. The recording was already underway. He turned on the camera from the first seconds, as soon as he realized what was happening. Let there be proof at least, he thought with a bitter grin, trying to drown out the pain in his chest. What he would do with this evidence, he did not yet know. But he simply could not leave here without everything, pretending that he had seen nothing. Through the sound of his own frantic pulse, he caught Jenny's muffled moans, which seemed to reach straight to his ears, even through the glass. He saw how she threw her head back, digging into Craig, and understood. She was completely consumed by passion without a trace. At that moment, Chris felt as if the world had shattered into fragments. Everything that was dear and sacred to him went to dust. "I believed you, Jenny," his mind screamed. "You were everything to me. And now?" I wanted to jump out from around the corner, break into the house, scream, rip them off. But something was holding him back. Maybe the fear of seeing their eyes full of guilt, or not guilt at all, but even more passionate challenges. Maybe the understanding that once he looked her in the face, he would not be able to live in the old way. Every movement inside the room sent a wave of despair through Chris. Every moan from Jenny reminded him how far he was now from her desires and feelings. Each kiss from Craig felt like a shot to the heart, leaving bleeding holes. And yet he couldn't look away, couldn't bring himself to stop recording. He had to record this moment of betrayal to the end, as if confirming to himself that this was not a bad dream, but reality. When Craig and Jenny finally slowed down, exhausted and hot, Chris felt like he was barely breathing. His hands were numb, his lips were dry, and his head was buzzing from an excess of adrenaline. "Damn rubbish," he pounded inside. "How could you?" But there was no answer. He only saw how she pressed herself against her neighbor's chest, languishing with pleasure, and understood. It was all over. His old life collapsed. He made a final effort, turned off the recording, and put the phone in his pocket. Closing his eyes for a split second, Chris felt the bitter taste of despair on his lips. From the moment he saw with his own eyes that she was joyfully giving herself to another, his existence changed irrevocably, and now he knew that neither Jenny nor himself would ever be the same. Chris sat in the car, clutching his phone. The screen went dark, but he knew that all he had to do was press the button, and the moment when the world as he knew it began to collapse would appear before his eyes again. My heart was pounding loudly in my chest. My thoughts were confused, replacing each other at breakneck speed. He couldn't believe it. Jenny. Hi, Jenny. The one he loved and trusted. Hundreds of questions were spinning in my head. How long does this last? When did it all start? What did she tell him when she returned home? How many times had she looked into his eyes, smiled, lied? The recording on the phone was irrefutable. There was no point in making up excuses. There was no way to convince himself that he had it all wrong. But even with this knowledge, Chris felt two forces fighting inside him, rage and despair. One required immediate action to break into the house, show Jenny the recording, and force her to confess. The other whispered, "No, wait. Find out more. Prepare yourself. Take revenge." He wanted to scream. The pain in my chest grew, rolling in waves, squeezing my throat, depriving me of breath. He closed his eyes and leaned back in his seat. Pictures of their life together arose before him. Their first meeting, travel, holidays, random moments of happiness. It all seemed like a lie now. Or was it true? When exactly did everything go wrong? He couldn't just storm home and demand an explanation. He needed to be smarter. He has already installed a tracking program and has already begun collecting evidence. But what next? Talk, scandal, or something more? His fingers clenched the steering wheel. He understood one thing. The moment he took the next step, there would be no turning back. Chris lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, but all he could see was his phone screen. His fingers trembled, but he pressed play again and again. The video started with a slight camera movement, then a slow zoom, focusing on the window. The curtains are parted slightly, soft light falling on the two people inside. They stand close, too close. Chris holds his breath. Craig leans in and Jenny bows her head slightly. His hand touches her waist. At this moment, Chris's every muscle tenses, but he doesn't look away. Every time he watched the video, he hoped to see something new. The slightest hint of ambiguity, a detail that could change the meaning of what is happening. Maybe he's missing something. Maybe he didn't understand everything correctly. But the more he looked, the more obvious it became everything was exactly as he had feared. Muffled laughter comes through the window. Jenny smiles. That look with which she had once looked at him was now intended for someone else. He tried to analyze. Maybe it's just a friendly moment. Maybe he's exaggerating the situation. But the longer he looked, the more his doubts turned into confidence. They are not just friends, not just neighbors. Chris felt a heavy emptiness squeezing his chest. My heart was beating too loudly, and my breathing became irregular. He pressed play again, and again, over and over again, as if he hoped that the next time he watched something would change, that he would suddenly see a completely different picture. But every frame said one thing: she betrayed him. The phone started to die, but he couldn't tear himself away. The room was quiet, only the steady breathing of Jenny, sleeping next to her, could be heard. How could she sleep peacefully when Chris was torn apart from the inside? How could she hide all this so skillfully? He turned his gaze to her. The dark silhouette covered with a blanket seemed so familiar, but now he did not know who was in front of him. It seemed as if a complete stranger was lying next to him. My thoughts were racing chaotically. What to do next? Should I tell her that he knows everything? Or collect more evidence? Maybe he should just leave. But where? That night his reality crumbled, and there was no way out. His chest tightened when his mind suggested a cruel thought. What if this is not the first time? How long does this last? How many nights like this had he spent in the dark while she? Chris clenched his teeth. He couldn't just wait. Tomorrow he had to do something. But now, in this endless night, he just continued to stare at the screen. And even when his eyelids began to close heavily, the last thing he saw before falling into a restless sleep was their silhouettes outside that very window. Chris woke up the next day with a clear resolve. The pain of betrayal no longer tore him from the inside. Now it turned into an icy, focused rage. He knew what to do. He had a plan. Every month since they moved to the area, he, Craig, and his wife had had their traditional get-together dinners. A friendly tradition that they maintained for years. Light conversations, discussion of work, glasses of good wine, an ideal screen for neighborly comfort. Only this time everything will be different. Jenny had already left for work, and Chris, having barely finished his morning coffee, picked up the phone and dialed a familiar number. He listened to the beeps for a second, and then Craig's voice came, calm as always. "Hi, friend. How are you?" Chris smiled, forcing himself to speak evenly, without a hint of tension. "Hello, Craig. We haven't had dinner for a long time. I think we should catch up. Tonight at my place. What do you say?" "Oh, that sounds great," Craig laughed. "Will Jenny be there?" Chris paused before answering. "No, she's at work late today, but we can sit together. Let's chat like men and relax. I have excellent wine." He heard Craig think on the other end of the line. He clearly did not expect such an offer. However, after a moment, his tone remained unchanged. "Great. Is 8 o'clock okay?" "Quite. I'm waiting for you, friend." Chris hung up the phone and exhaled slowly. Tension was boiling inside him, but he could not allow himself to break down. He spent the whole day thinking about what this evening should look like. Everything must be perfect. He prepared thoroughly. I bought a bottle of expensive red wine, cooked steaks, and set the table the way they always did. Everything had to look natural. He even turned on jazz, the same jazz that Craig had praised at one of the previous dinners. At 7:55 p.m., Chris heard the doorbell ring. He put a smile on his face, pulled himself together, and went to open it. Craig stood on the threshold in his usual image, relaxed, confident, with a slight smile on his face. He brought a bottle of whiskey. "Well, buddy, are we having a men's evening?" He grinned, going inside. Chris patted him on the shoulder, feeling everything boil inside. But he smiled, poured the wine, and sat down opposite. The evening was just beginning. "By the way, you came up with a great idea," Craig said, taking a sip from his glass. "I didn't even think that we would have the opportunity to sit properly without our ladies." "Yes, sometimes it's good to talk like a man." Chris took a sip, carefully watching Craig's face. "Relax, remember the old times. No tension." "I agree," Craig smiled. "Although, to be honest, I have a feeling that you want to talk about more than just the past. Did something happen? Chris paused, then smiled a little wider. You know, there are times when a person begins to notice things that previously seemed insignificant to him, he said, leaning forward slightly. For example, have you ever felt that someone you trust might betray you? Craig frowned, but quickly regained his carefree expression. What are you talking about? Did something happen at work? Chris shook his head, still looking at him intently. No, these are just thoughts out loud. Probably everyone has such moments. When you suddenly see a picture that you had not noticed before. Craig chuckled nervously, taking another sip of wine. Philosophical conversations have started, right? He grinned. Look, if you have any problems, just tell me. We're friends. Chris nodded, but everything was boiling inside him. He sensed that Craig suspected something. This was even better. Let him feel the storm coming. Chris watched Craig with cold concentration, hiding behind a smile all the storm of emotions that was tearing him apart from the inside. The conversation flowed calmly, as if they were really just two old friends who had decided to spend the evening over a glass of good wine. But in fact, this evening was prepared with special care. He was waiting for the right moment. I couldn't rush. Craig was attentive, relaxed, but still experienced. However, alcohol gradually did its job, and Chris saw how the interlocutor became less focused, smiled more often, and joked more. It was the perfect moment. You know, Chris said, standing up and heading to the kitchen cabinet, I have something special here. I brought it from France a couple of years ago. A very rare wine with a deep, rich taste. Craig chuckled, raising his glass. You intrigue me, buddy. Let's try it. Just hope it's not something too sour. You know, I appreciate gentleness. You just don't know how to enjoy real aromas, Chris grinned. This wine is special. It takes time to unfold. Chris took out a bottle that had been prepared in advance. He knew Craig didn't know enough about wine to tell the difference. The main thing was to do everything naturally. He poured ruby liquid into the guest's glass, and at that moment his fingers deftly made an imperceptible movement. The small capsule dissolved without a trace. He sat down opposite, raised his glass, and smiled. For old friendship, Craig. For old friendship, he nodded, not suspecting anything. He raised the glass to his lips and took a deep sip. Then another one. Well, how do you like it? Chris asked, leaning forward, intently studying his reaction. Craig twirled the glass in his hands, furrowing his brow. Interesting taste. He squinted. A little bitter aftertaste. But I think it's just my taste buds being capricious. No, you're just used to the sweet drink. Chris grinned, pretending to be relaxed. They continued their conversation. Chris watched every change in his interlocutor's facial expression. After a few minutes, Craig winced slightly and rubbed his temples. Ugh, he breathed. The wine is, of course, strong. Or have I already had enough? Just relax, Chris grinned. Everything is under control. Do you want some water? No. Craig waved his hand. It's just that my head is kind of heavy. A few more minutes passed, and Craig began to slowly lean towards the table. His gaze became distracted, his movements slowed down. Damn, I don't think I'm feeling well, he muttered, trying to get up, but his legs wouldn't obey. Something strange. Chris watched as Craig finally lost control. His eyes rolled back, and after a second he sank limply into the chair, then slowly slid down. There was silence. Chris looked at the man lying in front of him and felt a cold satisfaction growing in him. Now he had time. Now he could do whatever he set his mind to. Chris stood over Craig's unconscious body, feeling a cold, calculating determination growing within him. His plan was entering its next phase, and there was no time for hesitation now. Everything had to look convincing. Carefully, trying not to cause sudden movements, he grabbed Craig by the shoulders and dragged him into the guest room. He was heavier than he looked, but Chris no longer felt tired. The desire to complete everything was seething inside him. He laid Craig on the bed and straightened his arms, creating the appearance of natural relaxation. Then he opened the pre-prepared box. It contained things that were supposed to make the scene as convincing as possible. The first thing he did was take out Jenny's lingerie, set a lace bra and panties. They still smelled of her perfume. This smell might have brought back fond memories in another time, but now it was just a tool. Chris casually tossed the underwear next to Craig, as if it had been thrown off in a fit of passion. Then he pulled out some cheap jewelry, a bracelet that looked provocative enough to suggest it had been left behind by his mistress. Chris carefully laid them out on the nightstand, adding another finishing touch to the arrangement. Pomade. Red, bright, defiant. He twisted it, left a smeared mark on the glass, as if after a kiss, and then drew a light line along the collar of Craig's shirt. This touch was supposed to add believability. Having finished with the details, Chris stepped back and critically examined the painting. Yes, everything looked exactly as he had planned. A compromising scene that will leave no doubt. Now all that was left was to record it. He took out his phone and started filming, recording every element. He knew that these shots would become his weapon. His revenge was almost complete, but there was one more step ahead. Chris slowly lowered the phone, looking through the pictures he had taken. He made sure every detail was recorded: the carelessly scattered laundry, the lipstick marks, the mess in the room. It looked as if two ardent lovers had spent the night here. Now he needed to get rid of the traces. He carefully collected all the evidence, put the jewelry and linen back in the box, wiped the prints off the glass, and lightly smoothed the bed. Then he covered Craig with a blanket to keep him warm and walked out, carefully closing the door behind him. The whole house was filled with silence. Chris felt strangely empty, but at the same time there was a steely confidence inside him that everything was going according to plan. He went into his bedroom, lay down on the bed, and closed his eyes. Sleep did not come immediately, but after some time fatigue took its toll. When he woke up the next morning, the sun was already peeping through the windows. He sat up in bed, stretched, and listened to the house for a moment. Everything was calm. He then stood up and headed to the guest room. Craig was still asleep, sprawled out on the bed. Chris watched him for a few seconds before heading to the kitchen to make some coffee. The smell of fresh drink soon spread throughout the house, and after a while he heard Craig begin to toss and turn. A few minutes later, he appeared at the kitchen door, rubbing his temples. "Damn," Craig groaned, sitting down at the table. "My head is just about to explode." Chris placed a cup of coffee in front of him and grinned. "You had too much yesterday. I don't even remember the last time you passed out like that." Craig took the cup, took a sip, and winced. "Damn, yes, that was something. Sorry, friend, I didn't think I'd get so drunk. I hope I haven't said too much." Chris smiled, hiding his true thoughts behind her. "No, everything was fine. You just passed out. I put you in the guest room." Craig sighed in relief, rubbing his face. "Thank you, Chris. I don't know what I would do without you." Chris just nodded, taking another sip of his coffee. He knew that soon the whole game would reach a new level. By the way, Craig leaned back in his chair, rubbing the back of his head. "I remember that we discussed something important yesterday, but my head is empty. Were we talking about something serious?" Chris pretended to think, then grinned. "No, mostly we just chatted. You complained about work, reminisced about old times. Normal drunken conversation." Craig chuckled, shaking his head in disbelief. "You know, it feels like I'm missing something. It's like I had a gap last night." "It's alcohol," Chris answered calmly, finishing his coffee. "Nothing unusual." Craig nodded, but his brow remained furrowed. He rubbed his temples again and sighed. "Damn, I hope I at least didn't break anything or make a mess." Chris chuckled. "No, everything is fine. You just passed out as soon as you touched the bed." Craig laughed and reached for a second cup of coffee. "Well, good. Next time remind me to know when to stop." "Definitely," Chris answered with a slight smile. But other thoughts were already boiling inside him. He knew this morning was just the beginning. Chris sat at the table, tapping his fingers on the phone screen. Before him was a carefully thought-out plan to strike from both sides at once, to deliver such a crushing blow from which no one could justify himself. He knew that revenge was an art that required patience and precision, and he was willing to see it through to the end. He spent the whole day thinking about the details. Everything had to look natural, as if it were just an accident, as if the very fact of exposure was a matter of time. He prepared photographs incriminating shots of Craig lying in his guest room, surrounded by lingerie and lipstick. It was a perfect picture of betrayal, skillfully created by himself. But this was not enough. He remembered the video he had taken that night outside Craig's window. There, Jenny and Craig stood too close. Their conversation was filled with hidden meaning, even if the words could not really be heard. Their poses, head tilts, manner of interaction, all this added up to a too obvious hint. Chris started with the first step. He created a new anonymous account in one of the popular instant messengers. He didn't want to leave traces, didn't want to be found out. He downloaded a special application that allows him to send messages from temporary numbers. He even considered a VPN to make sure no one could trace the shipment. The addressee was obvious Linda, Craig's wife, a woman who was always polite but seemed too trusting to Chris. She drove away, leaving Craig alone, unaware of what was going on behind her back. Now he was going to reveal the truth to her. He selected the photographs and edited them to make them look even more incriminating. Added text, "You must know the truth. Look at what your husband does while you're away." He checked everything again, making sure that the message conveyed the desired effect. Then I took a deep breath and pressed send. The message disappeared, sent into obscurity. He felt his heart beat faster. It was done. There was no turning back. But he wasn't going to stop. Now comes the second step. He added a video recording taken under the window of Craig's house to the messages, attached it to another message and wrote, "And this is another proof. Maybe after this you won't have any doubts." He pressed send and leaned back in his chair, looking at the screen. Now all that was left was to wait. Chris sat holding the phone in his hands and watched the screen, waiting for a reaction. The message was delivered and read. There was only a second of tense waiting left, and then 3 dots for answering appeared. Linda didn't have to wait long. "What? This? Like this?" appeared on the screen. Then a moment later, a new message. "Where was this filmed? When?" A feeling of satisfaction filled his chest. The first part of the plan worked. He imagined Linda flipping through photographs and videos in a panic, replaying the details over and over, trying to comprehend what exactly she was seeing. She most likely doesn't believe her eyes, but the evidence speaks for itself. Chris knew that Craig would soon face a storm that he would not be able to cope with. While he was thinking about his next step, the phone rang. It was Jenny. My heart froze for a second. He took a deep breath and answered. "Hello, dear." My wife's voice sounded tired, but calm. "I decided to come home early." Chris almost laughed at the irony of the situation. His wife returns home just as his carefully planned storm is about to erupt. "This is wonderful, honey," he said as softly as possible. "I missed you too. When will you be there?" "In a couple of hours." "Are you home?" "Yes, I'm waiting for you," he answered, carefully hiding the rising excitement in his voice. He felt how everything was going according to his script. Now the 2 people he wanted to bring to light will find themselves in the same place at the most inopportune time for them. Linda rushes home, driven by anger. Jenny returns, suspecting nothing. And Craig doesn't even realize that the ring is closing around him. He needed time to prepare. He got up and walked around the room. It was necessary to create an atmosphere of calm, to pretend that nothing special was happening. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, took a sip and smiled. The coming evening promised to be truly unforgettable. Chris looked at his watch. There were less than 2 hours left before Jenny arrived. He turned on the music to drown out the noise of his own thoughts a little and sat down on the sofa. Jenny returned home early in the evening. As soon as she entered the house, Chris felt the tension in the air become almost palpable. He sat in the living room, calmly sipping whiskey, as if he was completely relaxed, but inside him seethed with icy determination. His fingers squeezed his glass a little tighter when he heard the sound of her footsteps in the hallway. She threw her coat on the hanger and walked into the room, shaking her hair as if trying to shake off the day's fatigue. Her face was usually calm, but Chris already knew that now he looked at her differently. "Hello, dear," she smiled, but there was a slight weariness in her voice. "How was your day?" Chris looked at her over the top of his glass and raised his eyebrows slightly. His lips stretched into the shadow of a grin. "Oh, great," he said with deliberate nonchalance. "Even better than I could have expected." Jenny froze for a second, as if something had alarmed her, but quickly pulled herself together and headed to the kitchen. She opened the refrigerator, took out a bottle of water, and twisted the lid tightly, as if trying to concentrate on something mundane. "Sounds intriguing. Did something happen?" she asked, turning to the tabletop. Chris put the glass on the table and leaned back on the sofa, pretending to be completely relaxed. He loved such moments when words acted more slowly than gestures and penetrated deeper, leaving doubt in the mind of the interlocutor. "Yes, you could say that," he finally answered. "Today was an interesting day overall. Learned a couple of new things about people I trust." She froze, holding the bottle in her hands. Her fingers trembled slightly as she reached for the glass. She took a sip, but did not immediately turn around. "Is it true?" she asked calmly, trying to seem at ease. "And about whom?" Chris watched her carefully. He saw how tension ran through her shoulders, how she became more careful in her movements. Jenny had always been able to control herself, but now it seemed to him that he saw more than before. "Yes, so. In general, I was just thinking about betrayal," he said slowly, savoring every word. "About the fact that people sometimes wear masks, hide something, pretend that everything is fine until the truth comes out." She spun around, clutching the water bottle until her knuckles turned white. "You speak in riddles, Chris." "What do you mean?" Her voice sounded evenly, but something flashed in her eyes that he immediately caught: concern. He grinned and stood up from the couch, slowly walking closer. Now they stood face to face. Just thinking out loud, he shrugged, studying every emotion running across her face. "You know I don't like surprises. I like to know what's going on in my life. What about you?" She swallowed. Her smile faltered slightly, but she quickly hid it with another sip of water. Her gaze darted to the side, as if she was looking for somewhere to put the bottle. "Of course," she answered, turning to the sink. "Who doesn't like honesty?" Chris didn't look away. He saw how hard she tried to control herself, but now every little thing in her behavior seemed like evidence to him. He took another step forward, watching as her breathing became a little deeper. "That's great," he said softly, pretending that this topic was closed, "because sometimes honesty is the only thing that can save a person." Chris felt a storm of emotions building inside him. Anger, resentment, jealousy, everything mixed into one poisonous cocktail that took your breath away. But what intoxicated him most of all was a strange feeling of satisfaction. He was no longer a confused husband, no longer a victim. Now he was in control of the situation. Her every movement, every word now had a new meaning for him, a new subtext, which he unraveled with painful pleasure. He watched Jenny, who stood at the sink with her lips pressed tightly together. She pretended to calmly drink water, but her hand trembled treacherously. She felt his gaze and knew that he did not look away. This tension between them became more and more palpable, as if something inevitable hung in the air. "You're kind of strange today," she finally spoke, trying to keep her voice even. "Did something happen?" Chris chuckled slowly, took the glass from the table, and took a small sip of whiskey, stretching out the pause. He was enjoying the moment. Her nervousness, her growing anxiety. "No, it's okay," he answered, looking straight into her eyes. "It's just sometimes interesting how well we know the people we love." Jenny tensed. He saw concern flash in her eyes. It was almost imperceptible, but for Chris it was a clear signal. She's nervous. Her mind is already filled with anxious thoughts. "What are you talking about, Chris?" she asked carefully, tilting her head slightly to the side, as if trying to read the expression on his face. He put the glass on the table and took a step forward. Now they were just a few centimeters apart. Jenny pulled back a little, but then pulled herself together. She didn't want to show her emotions, but Chris could already sense her fear. About how people know how to hide the truth, he continued, closely watching her every move. Pretend that everything is fine, until one day it comes out. Her lips trembled, but she quickly controlled herself. You speak in riddles, she breathed. If you have something to say it directly. He took another step. Now he saw everything, her tense posture, her arms pressed to her sides, her nervous gaze. She felt threatened, and this gave him strength. Everything will be said in due time, Jenny, he said calmly. For now, just think about honesty. She swallowed and looked away. Then she pretended to be busy with something insignificant. She wiped the wet tabletop, straightened the sleeve of her sweater, but all this looked like an attempt to avoid a real conversation. Chris, if you have a problem with me, just tell me. Her voice sounded firmer, but he heard a shadow of uncertainty in it. He grinned. She was already starting to defend herself. A little more, and the mask of calm will crack. I'm just speculating, he said with the air of a man discussing a philosophical question. You know, there is such a thing called intuition. Sometimes she tells you that they are lying to you, even when at first glance everything seems normal. He looked at her without blinking. Jenny took a deep breath, her hands clenched into fists. We're all hiding something, Chris, she said finally. The question is how important it is. Chris nodded, took another sip of whiskey, and slowly put the glass back on the table. Exactly, he muttered. The question is how important it is. Chris heard the squeal of brakes, then the sound of a door slamming. He knew it was Linda. She arrived earlier than expected, but that's even better. He put down the glass of whiskey, took a deep breath, and slowly walked towards the window. Craig's wife literally ran out of the car, slamming the door so hard that the window shook. Her face was twisted with rage, her hair was disheveled, and she was clutching the phone in her hands. Linda didn't even knock, she slammed open the front door of her house. Craig, she screamed so loudly that the echo echoed throughout the street. Come out here immediately. Chris, smiling, took a sip of whiskey and sat down in a chair. Now it all depended on how strong the scene was. Craig appeared at the door, sleepy, wearing a wrinkled t-shirt, rubbing his face. Linda, what are you? He began, but his voice was drowned in a stream of furious accusations. Do you dare ask? She shook the phone in front of his face. What is this? Who filmed this? Can you explain to me what the hell you were doing while I was away? Craig frowned, trying to see the screen. He still didn't fully understand what was happening. Linda, wait, what are you talking about? He tried to take her hands, but she abruptly pulled away. Don't you dare touch me. Her voice trembled with emotion. Did you think I wouldn't find out anything? Did you think you could keep lying to my face? Chris kept his eyes on the stage, enjoying every moment. It was even better than he had imagined. Craig was completely confused, his eyes darting around the room, looking for any explanation for what had just befallen him. Linda, I swear I don't know what this photo is, he finally shouted, clutching his head. I don't even remember anything like that. Who made them? But his wife no longer heard. She rushed around the house, grabbing his things and throwing them towards the exit. Get out, she screamed. Immediately, I don't want to see you in this house. Chris continued to watch this performance, enjoying the chaos it created. Now all that remained was to wait for the next move. Craig stood in the middle of the room, confused and completely dumbfounded. His gaze darted from Linda to her phone screen, then back again. His wife was seething with anger, but Chris, who was watching what was happening, noticed something else. There was something else hidden behind her rage. Perhaps it was pain, perhaps it was fear, but most importantly, she did not want to listen to any excuses. Speak. Linda clenched her teeth, stepping forward menacingly. Did you sleep with her? Have you been lying to me this whole time? Linda, I swear to you. Craig took a step back, almost tripping over his chair. This is not what you think. Jenny and I. That's a completely different story. Linda snorted, her eyes flashing with a new charge of hatred. Another story? Are you serious? She waved the phone in front of his face. What should I think then, huh? Photos, videos. Can you explain what the hell you were doing with her that evening? Craig ran his hand over his face, his fingers trembling. Linda, it all started much earlier. This is not what you imagined. Chris, listening to this dialogue from the shadows, felt a strange pang. This was not part of his plan. He expected screams, a row, maybe even Linda hitting her husband in the face. But these words, it all started earlier. What is he talking about? Craig, I'm waiting. Linda crossed her arms over her chest. Either you confess now, or I'll throw your things out onto the street. Craig swallowed, ran his hand over the back of his head, and exhaled heavily. It has to do with money, he finally said, with one story that happened several years ago. Linda narrowed her eyes. What other money? But Chris already knew he had opened Pandora's box, and it seems he himself did not understand what exactly he had just released. Linda suddenly froze, and then her face contorted with furious rage. She turned around sharply and, waving her phone, shouted, "This Jenny of yours is the last bitch who spreads her legs in front of everyone. Do you think I'll just leave it like that?" Her voice trembled with hatred. "I'll go to her right now and rip out all her hair. Let's see how she will have sex after this." Craig rushed towards her, trying to hold her back, but Linda was too furious. She pushed him in the chest, causing him to stagger. "Don't you dare touch me," she gasped with rage. "You destroyed our family for the sake of this crappy creature. You don't even understand, Craig, that you're finished." Chris cautiously moved closer to Craig's house, hiding in the shade of the trees. His heart was pounding in his chest, adrenaline flowing through his body. He knew that now he might hear something that would change everything. He took out his phone and started up the recorder, clutching it in his hand, ready to record every sound. Muffled voices came from inside. Linda was still screaming, but now her rage had changed to a demanding tone. "I'm waiting for an explanation. Craig, have you lost your tongue? What kind of money? What kind of old story is this?" Chris held his breath. There was a tense pause, then Craig's voice, quiet and broken. "Linda, it's not what you think. Jenny, she's in trouble. I just held her in my hands." "In what other hands?" Linda practically choked with anger. "Are you saying that you were covering for her?" Chris leaned against the wall, listening. He knew Craig was about to reveal something important. A few years ago, Craig's voice trembled. "Jenny, she hit a man." There was deathly silence in the house. Even Linda fell silent for a moment. Chris gripped the recorder tighter, feeling his fingers become covered in sweat. What?" Linda whispered, unable to believe what she heard. "She was scared, Linda," Craig almost shouted. "It was an accident, but she ran away. She left him there, to die on the side of the road." Chris felt his throat go dry. He couldn't believe his ears. Jenny, his wife, a killer? And you knew this all this time? Linda slowly came to her senses. Her voice now sounded different, like that of a person who had just seen a monster. "I saw her by chance then," Craig admitted, breathing heavily. "I was driving along the same road and saw her standing next to the car. She was in a panic. But when I got closer, she was already leaving. I went to check, and he was lying there. The man. He was still breathing, Linda." "Oh, God." Her voice became hoarse. "Why didn't you say anything? Why didn't you go to the police?" Craig laughed bitterly. "Do you think she wouldn't blame everything on me? I saw her license plates. I knew whose car it was. But she knew that I was there too. She could tell that I did it." "Did you blackmail her?" Linda gasped, taking a step back. "All this time?" "No." Craig raised his hands as if in defense. At first I just wanted her to confess. But then, she came to me herself. She asked me to be silent. She was terrified, Linda. And you just agreed?" Linda started screaming. "How could you? I thought I was doing the right thing," Craig whispered. "But when I told her that sooner or later she would have to pay for her actions, she found another way out." Linda frowned. What do you mean? What other way out? Craig lowered his head as if he was ashamed. She knew what I liked. I always knew. He smiled bitterly. She offered me what I had long dreamed of. Instead of money, instead of threats. Linda was stunned for a second, then her face contorted with disgust. You mean that you slept with her? Craig looked away. She knew I cared, that I wanted her for a long time, and she took advantage of it. Linda clenched her fists, her hands shaking. You, bastard. You both are dirty, lying creatures. Chris slowly lowered the phone as it was recording. He had come here to expose betrayal, but now he knew something much worse. Chris sat in the car, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. A storm of thoughts raged in my head. He came here to expose the betrayal, to catch Jenny in the betrayal, but now everything turned out to be much more complicated. His wife wasn't just hiding an affair, she was hiding a crime. He turned the phone back on and heard Craig's voice. She knew. What I liked, I always knew. She offered me what I had long dreamed of. Instead of money, instead of threats. The words hit him over the head again, like a hot blade piercing his brain. He imagined Jenny backed into a corner, panicking, ready to do anything to avoid prison. Was it really treason, or the desperate deal she made to save herself? He remembered her eyes, how they lit up when she laughed at his jokes, how she touched his hand at dinner. These moments now seemed false, but at the same time, he knew her fears, knew how much she was afraid of losing everything. But could he justify her? Could this be forgiven? Anger and pain fought inside him, mixing with something akin to pity. He didn't know what to do next. His world had collapsed, but the answers to his questions only made things more difficult. He wanted to scream, he wanted to demand an explanation, but he understood that now he no longer knew what exactly he needed to hear from her. He turned the recording back on, and again, as if he was hoping to hear something in the voices that would change his perception. But the truth remained unchanged. His wife was hiding from him not just betrayal, but something much more terrible. Chris entered the house, feeling the tension squeezing his chest. He didn't know what to expect. Jenny sat on the edge of the sofa, her shoulders shaking. As soon as she saw him, her face contorted in pain, but he did not let her say a word. Instead, he silently took out his phone, pressed the screen, and started recording. Craig's voice filled the silence of the room. She knew. What I liked, I always knew. She offered me what I had long dreamed of. Instead of money, instead of threats. Jenny turned pale, and her eyes widened in horror. Chris, her voice trembled. I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't know. His voice was cold, distant. Or didn't you want to? He remained standing, not approaching. Her tears no longer touched him the way they used to. Now he was not sure that he knew the woman with whom he had lived for so many years. Tell me everything. His voice sounded low and firm. No lies, no omissions. Just tell the truth. Jenny covered her face with her hands, breathing heavily. I didn't want to hide it, but I was afraid, Chris. I knew that you are a man of honor. You would never let me hide this. You would have insisted that I go to the police. Chris clenched his jaw, his hands clenched into fists. Of course, I would insist, because it's right. I couldn't, she screamed. I was in a panic, I didn't know what to do. It all happened so fast. I just wanted it to go away. May this never happen. He looked at her, studying every expression on her face. Pain, fear, remorse, all this was mixed in her eyes, but was it sincere, or was she just trying to save herself? You couldn't trust me. His voice sounded bitter. Did you really think that I would leave you? I didn't know, she whispered. I was afraid that I would lose you, that I'll lose everything. I couldn't risk it. But you were able to sleep with Craig to hush this matter up. His voice was filled with disgust. She sobbed, shaking her head. It's not what you think. I didn't want to. At first, I just offered him money. And... Her voice trembled, she swallowed, and to give him pleasure if only he would remain silent. But this was not enough for him. He began to put pressure, threaten, and said that if I didn't agree to more and didn't have sex with him whenever he wanted, he would tell everything. I was trapped, Chris. He took advantage of the situation. He knew I was desperate. Chris shook his head. You could have told me. Instead, you chose him. You chose to lie. You chose fear. Jenny covered her mouth with her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs. Chris took a deep breath. He expected to hear something like that, but the reality was even harder. Now he had to decide if he could forgive her or if this was the end. Chris sat in the kitchen, staring into an empty glass. The warm light of the lamp seemed too bright and irritating. Emotions were still raging inside him, but now that the anger had subsided a little, it was replaced by emptiness. Jenny was in the bedroom. He heard her muffled sobs. A few hours ago, he thought that he had learned the truth, that he had exposed her betrayal, but now the whole situation looked different. He thought that his revenge would be the triumph of justice, but instead he found himself in the chaos that he himself created. Yes, Jenny didn't love Craig. I didn't meet him secretly. I didn't dream about him. She didn't betray Chris in the way he thought she would. But that didn't make the situation any easier. She hid something much worse from him, and now he couldn't understand what was worse. Her fear of the truth or his own mistake, which destroyed everything. He would like to say that now he will simply forget everything, that he will be able to understand her, but trust. Trust was broken. They were both to blame, but can they now look into each other's eyes without a past between them? Chris ran his hand over his face and took a deep breath. He felt that their marriage was hanging by a thread. But what to do now? Forgive her? Forgive yourself? Or is this the end? Linda stood in the doorway, her eyes blazing with rage. She was clutching the phone in her hands, and the photos that had been sent to her were still open on the screen. Craig tried to speak, to make excuses, but every sound he made only fueled her anger. Do you think that I will believe in some ridiculous accident? She screamed, shaking the phone in his face. What is this, Photoshop? Or maybe you will say that it was not you. Craig ran his hand through his hair in frustration, taking a step back. Linda, please listen to me. It's not what you think. Someone set it all up. Set it up? She laughed bitterly. Do you really think I'm an idiot? These photographs. She squeezed the phone forcefully. This is proof. I thought you'd at least come up with a decent excuse, but you're not even trying. Craig swallowed nervously. He felt like he was losing control of the situation. I swear, I don't know who did this. It's her fault. Linda clenched her fists, her body trembling with tension. That's it, Craig. Enough. I'm not going to take this anymore. Did you think that I would turn a blind eye to all this? Should I just calm down? Her voice trembled, but there was steely determination in it. Tomorrow I'm filing for divorce. Craig stepped towards her, but she raised her hand to stop him. Don't touch me, she hissed. It's over. Chris sat in the dark, holding the phone in his hands. His fingers trembled, but he pressed play again. The video he had recorded at the window of Craig's house started up again, but now he looked at it differently. Familiar silhouettes flashed on the screen. Jenny and Craig were standing too close. Then, in a fit of rage, it seemed to him that he saw the obvious treason, betrayal. But now, after all the details that had been revealed, he noticed details that he had previously ignored. Jenny looked tense. She pulled away slightly, but Craig moved closer to her. Her movements were abrupt, as if she was trying to explain something, but Craig did not back down. Chris paused the video, looking at his wife's expression. Was it fear, awkwardness, or is it something else? He rewinded and turned it on again. Now he saw that her hand was shaking. She didn't touch Craig. On the contrary, her fingers clenched into a fist. Was this a sign of resistance, or was she trying to maintain her composure? Chris closed his eyes and exhaled. His own assumptions were crumbling one by one. This was not just betrayal. It was forced intimacy, possibly threats, or even a provocation. He turned the recording back on, determined to understand once and for all what exactly happened that night. Chris sat on the edge of the bed, staring at a spot on the floor. His mind raced between options, each of which threatened irreparable consequences. His entire life had collapsed in a matter of days, and now he was faced with a choice on which his future depended. Jenny went to her mother. He himself asked her to do this, not because he hated her, but because he couldn't look her in the eyes. I couldn't understand what to do now. The first option, hand over the recording and everything he learned to the police. To obey the law, to do the right thing. But to completely destroy the life of the woman he had lived with for so many years. She deserved to be punished for her actions, but did she deserve to completely collapse? Second option, deal with Craig. He knew that he was taking advantage of the situation. He knew that he was manipulating Jenny. If we eliminate the blackmail, maybe then Jenny will be able to live in peace. But at what cost? And will this really solve everything? Third option, forgive her. Close your eyes to everything, try to leave it in the past. But how can you start again after something like this? How to live knowing that she hid the truth from him? Chris clenched his fingers into a fist. He didn't know what to do. Every decision seemed wrong, every one led to loss, and time was ticking inexorably. Chris looked at the phone for a long time, scrolling through all the possible outcomes of the conversation in his head. He didn't know what Jenny would say, but he knew one thing for sure: he couldn't leave everything in limbo. He dialed her number. Chris? Jenny's voice was weak and alarming. "We need to talk," he said, trying to keep his voice even. There was silence for a second, and then she quietly answered, "Fine, I will come." Less than an hour passed before he heard the sound of her car in the yard. Chris opened the door and saw her exhausted, with reddened eyes. She stepped inside, clenching her hands into fists. "Thank you for calling." Her voice trembled. Chris motioned for her to go into the living room. He didn't know where to start, but he couldn't remain silent any longer. "You should have told me the truth, Jenny," he spoke calmly, but there was pain in his voice. "Everything could have been different." She lowered her head, tears welling up in her eyes again. "I know," she whispered. "I was scared. I didn't know what to do, and then it was too late. Every day I thought about it, but I couldn't find the strength to admit it." "You trusted Craig, but not me," Chris continued, struggling to contain his emotions. "Why?" "I didn't trust him. He took advantage of the situation, Chris. I tried to find a way out, but I chose the worst possible one." Her voice broke. Chris ran his hand over his face. There was truth in her words. He saw before him not a woman who had betrayed him, but a man broken by fear and guilt. "I don't know if I can ever trust you again," he admitted, "but I want to understand. I want to know who we are now." Chris sat in the dark, holding his phone. The police number was on the screen, but the finger hovered over the call button. He felt his heart pounding in his chest, like two voices fighting in his head: duty and love. "I have to do this, Jenny." His voice was hoarse, as if he himself did not believe his words. "I can't live with this lie." She sat opposite, her hands clenched into fists, her eyes red from tears. "Chris," she whispered, unable to say more. He closed his eyes, remembering everything they had been through. Their first years together, laughter, happiness, warm evenings by the fireplace, the dreams they built. He saw before him not a criminal, but a woman whom he loved. A woman who had made a mistake, but whom he knew down to the smallest detail. "Damn," he breathed, his hand trembling. Chris looked at the phone screen, then back at her. She was exhausted, broken, but still alive, and he knew he couldn't lose her. Chris left the room, feeling his chest tighten with the weight of his decision. He knew there was no turning back. His fingers trembled as he picked up the phone and pressed call. All the events of the last days flashed through his mind: suspicion, surveillance, anger, despair. And now, at the very end of the road, he realized that he was not fighting for exposure. He fought for the truth. Jenny stood at the window. Her fragile figure seemed even smaller than usual. The light from the lantern outside the window outlined her silhouette, emphasizing her drooping shoulders and bowed head. She didn't cry loudly, she only sobbed occasionally, as if everything inside her was broken, but only weak signs of pain burst out. Chris slowly looked up at her. He knew her too well. I knew how she smiled when she made coffee in the morning, how she laughs at old films, even if she has seen them dozens of times, the way she looks at him when she thinks he doesn't notice, and he knew that this woman in front of him would never be the same, just like himself. I can't do this anymore. His voice was quiet but firm. We will do everything according to the law, but I'll be there. Jenny lifted her head, her gaze darting towards him with hope and fear. Chris, are you? Are you really? Her voice trembled, as if she didn't dare believe what she heard. He nodded, then looked away and, without hesitating another second, dialed the police number. The beeps seemed endless. Each of them was a step into the unknown. He felt Jenny slowly approach him, but did not touch him, as if she was afraid that he would change his mind. Police, how can I help you? The even voice of the dispatcher rang out. Chris swallowed and then pulled himself together and spoke. I want to report an accident. A few years ago, my wife was driving. She is ready to give in and tell the whole truth. A second of silence. Then the voice on the other end of the line became clearer, more focused. Please confirm your identity and provide details. Chris answered calmly while Jenny silently covered her face with her hands. He knew that ahead of them awaited trial, investigation, charges, and possibly a prison sentence. He knew that people would turn away, that the past would overtake them with renewed vigor. But he also knew that only now there were no more secrets between them. We are waiting for you at the station, the dispatcher concluded. Chris hung up the call and put the phone on the table. The silence in the house was almost ringing. Jenny raised her head. There were so many emotions in her eyes that he couldn't make out them all at once: fear, gratitude, bitterness, relief, and love. You won't leave me, she whispered. He exhaled and ran his hand over his face. No, he answered, but we have to go through this together. She sobbed and stepped towards him, but stopped at the last moment, giving him the right to decide for himself whether he would accept her into his arms. Chris closed his eyes, feeling a storm of emotions raging inside him. Everything has changed. They have changed. But maybe now they have a chance, albeit with a new, difficult beginning. The trial lasted several months. During this time, Chris and Jenny went through endless hearings, interrogations, and meetings with lawyers. Public opinion was divided. Some called Jenny a monster, others saw her as a victim of circumstances. But there was only one truth: she committed a crime, and now she had to answer for it. On the day of the verdict, the courtroom was filled to capacity. Chris sat in the front row, hands clasped, tense and silent. Jenny looked tired but collected. She accepted her fate and was not going to make excuses. The judge finally read the verdict. Jenny Harper pleads guilty to leaving the scene of a fatal accident. Taking into account mitigating circumstances, including voluntary confession and repentance, the court sentences her to 3 years in prison with the possibility of parole after a year and a half. There was a roar in the hall. Some were outraged by the leniency of the sentence, others breathed a sigh of relief. Chris felt a knot tighten inside him. That was the end, or perhaps a new beginning. But that was not the whole verdict. The judge turned his gaze to Craig. Craig Wilson is found guilty of concealing a crime and blackmail. Taking into account the degree of his guilt and manipulations in relation to the defendant, the court sentences him to 5 years in prison without the right to parole. Fear flashed across Craig's face. He didn't expect the trial to be so strict. His lawyer tried to say something, but the judge was no longer listening. Jenny looked at Chris, her eyes filled with tears. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She knew that the price had already been set. Chris took a deep breath. He didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know if he could forgive completely. But he knew one thing now: there were no more lies between them. As the guards led Craig away, Jenny took one last look at Chris before she was led out of the hall. He watched her leave, knowing that one day they would meet again, and then their new life will begin honest, without secrets, even if it will not be the same as before. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.